Our distinguished speaker today has been the British Trade Secretary, then Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, then spent 4 years in Brussels as European Trade Commissioner, and was first Secretary of State during the final years of Gordon Brown's time as Prime Minister. Today, he's a member of Parliament, a member of the House of Lords. I don't know what that was meant to be, and has just launched his autobiography, The Third Man, which has been topping the bestseller list in Britain. I'm going to call up Dean Kishore. I hope by now you know who Dean Kishore Mahbubani is, but you jolly well know which school he belongs to and is named after, and who he was named after. All right, the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, as you know, is not only is he a distinguished thinker, but he has been a distinguished ambassador of Singapore for many years, including being our ambassador in the United Nations and the United States of America. I'll call upon Professor Kishore Mahbubani to introduce our eminent speaker, Lord Mandelson.
Thank you, George. George is absolutely right. There's a tremendous amount of excitement in this room. I can feel about this event. And I'm sure that Lord Mandelson is not going to let us down. So my role is to stay here as briefly as possible and to explain why, as the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, I was truly delighted to be invited to moderate this event. Because at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, one of our missions is to teach young people about politics. And often we fail. Let me tell you a true story. One of our best students graduated, went back to his home country in Central Asia. Because he graduated from our school, he got a promotion, he became a director. When he became a director, he did the right thing. He promoted the good ones, and he sacked the bad ones. Unfortunately, some of the bad ones were very well connected politically. He survived as the director for 2 weeks. So I learned a very valuable lesson down there. That when before the school students graduate, they better learn a thing or two about politics. And that's at the micro level. But at the macro level, if you look at the leaders of the world, and you see how they're struggling, it's amazing what difficult terrain we are in politically. All the leaders of the world want to do good for the world, want to save the world from global warming. But when they go to Copenhagen, as President Obama did, Congress will not give him any mandate to make any compromises, so Copenhagen failed. Leaders want to take care of the future. They want to make sure that our grandchildren are better off than we are. But then they create these huge budget deficits, huge national debts, and if they want to raise taxes, that's politically suicide for them. Leaders also want to promote tolerance and create more multicultural understanding. But as you can see in the United States of America today, if you want to build a mosque, a community center in Manhattan, you get into trouble. So politics is clearly becoming more and more difficult in our world of today. So clearly we need to find somebody who can explain it all to us and tell us the right path to take. And as you know, in any field, there's always a preeminent figure. You know, in, say, software, it's Bill Gates. In investments, it's Warren Buffett. So if you're looking for the Bill Gates or the Warren Buffett of politics, it is, of course, Lord Peter Mandelson. And that's why it's a great privilege to have him here with us. Now, I was hoping that I could say some juicy things about him. I kept SMSing his good friend Ong Beng Seng and said, Beng Seng, give me some gossip. Came up with nothing at all. But in the end, as we were sitting down at lunch, we agreed that what makes Lord Mandelson's political career quite unique is that his political career is a bit like Deng Xiaoping's political career. He went down, he went up, he went down, he went up, and he eventually succeeded. And so that's the career of Lord Peter Mandelson. And of course, as you all know, even though he never became the Prime Minister of England, his two good friends, Tony Blair became Prime Minister, Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, but we all know that the real man who actually did all the hard work and made sure everything happened was, of course, Lord Mandelson. And if you want any kind of confirmation of this, I can tell you that I got it straight from the horse's mouth. I asked Lord Mandelson, as I was sitting next to him at lunch, I said, tell me, which is the best single book on politics that you've come across? He said, very easy. It's called The Third Man by Peter Mandelson. So over to you, Peter.
Professor Mahbubani, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. First of all, obviously, I'd like to know who it was precisely, in what table, groaned when the reference was made to the House of Lords. I want to know whether it was a groan of disquiet or approval. Sorry? Was that over there? But to be likened, I must say, to Deng Xiaoping is absolutely wonderful. I mean, I think I would have been more as successful as Deng if I had actually crossed the river by sort of feeling the stones gently one by one, as it was. I'm afraid that throughout my political life, I have spent my time jumping rather excitedly and violently and leaping from stone to stone, occasionally taking a rather large splash before I reached the bank of the river, but of course at the end of the day reached the other side, as my party did with me. And as for likening me to Mr. Buffett or Mr. Gates, well, I just wish I was quite as wealthy but who knows what the next 25 years will bring. Now look, it's a great pleasure for me to be in the Raffles Hotel because this, of course, was the venue of that great victory of my government, my then Prime Minister Tony Blair, in winning the great opportunity to host the Olympic Games. So well done, Britain, for winning, and well done, Singapore, for hosting that event in 2005 that has opened up that great opportunity for us. But above all, thank you all very much indeed for turning up to hear from a British politician about a book which I admit is largely, but not only, about British politics. And you all know why you are here, don't you? You know you don't leave until you've bought the book. That was the clear understanding, I think, on which you were all invited. And those of you who are lucky enough, I'd be very, very pleased and honoured to sign it and inscribe it for you. But I hope that by the time you leave, you will have discovered that my book and its story and the making of New Labour and what I've done in my life does have some relevance to you and to your life in Singapore. Our countries are certainly not identical, but we do have more than simply shared history. We, for example, have a very strong and resilient financial services in both Singapore and London, and I wish that we'd had a few more of Singapore's regulators in London before our financial services markets took a dive. But there's more than that in the overlap between us. And it's no accident that the first overseas audience that I have addressed in connection with my book is here in Singapore. And can I say also, I'm very pleased to see the British High Commissioner here, but also the head of the European Commission delegation, because they both represent both parts of my public life to date. Now, my book is part memoir, at the heart of British politics, but also of the European Commission in Brussels. But it's about how you bring about change. Change in a political party, change in a country, change in a business. And it is, of course, very hard to do that. But you know that because you've literally almost, well, not quite from nothing, but certainly from scratch, built an extraordinary modern economy and society here in Singapore. Actually, I was in Singapore 2 years ago, almost to the day. It was on the eve of the first Formula One race in Singapore, when the then British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, suddenly phoned me in my hotel here in Singapore, woke me up. I mean, he didn't know it was the middle of the night, but I think if he had known, it wouldn't have made any difference to him. You know, he had a sort of work ethic that never rested. And it was in that first phone call that he made to me when I was in Singapore that he gave me the initial hint of the great plan he had to rescue his government and his political fortunes. I think if I had allowed him to speak on during the call, I might have discovered that what he had in mind was what I discovered a week later, which was that I was to be the centrepiece of his great plan to rescue his government and his political fortunes. And it was then that I left Brussels and came back to the British government when the financial crisis hit and sent our poll ratings first plummeting, but then we managed to reverse them and put them onto an upward curve. But I just want to say this also about Singapore and the history of New Labour, because it was in Singapore that Tony Blair chose as the location in 1996, the year before he came to office as Prime Minister in Britain, to set out to make his speech which set out and defined his new politics of a stakeholder society, one that was not bounded by class divisions or outdated ideology, but able to fulfill a new potential both for our country and people in Britain, basically through a new relationship between the state and the individual. That was what the stakeholder society speech was all about. What he set out and described was not a sort of old-style state, but a more strategic and empowering one, based on individual aspiration and a belief in the power of education and innovation in driving a country's economy, of a partnership in wealth creation between private enterprise and public investment. Now, these are the forces that a modern economy and a successful society have to mobilize in order to do well. And if it sounds familiar to you who know and live in Singapore, it's meant to sound familiar, because that's exactly what Singapore has been doing for the last 50 or plus years, harnessing the power of both private enterprise and public investment, using and harnessing the power of an enabling strategic state, combined with that individual drive, that ambition that you have to capitalize on amongst your people in order to get on. Now, these are lessons that we took from Singapore, essentially a new model of capitalism, of a market economy, but also a society that's based on fair chances of opportunity for all. And the question is, why did the British Labour Party, over 100 years old, with its experience in government, having produced some good and successful British prime ministers over that century, why on earth did we have to start rethinking and look, for example, to a country like Singapore in order to rethink our own way forward and our policies and our political outlook? And the reason is, and this is a salutary warning to parties, businesses, countries, great corporations, we had during our 20 years or so out of power after we were evicted by Mrs. Thatcher in 1979, simply not kept track with how Britain was changing, how people were thinking, what they wanted, what they expected from a government, and the sorts of politicians that they wanted to see in office. We had, in a very real sense, as a political party, ceased to be fit for the purpose. It happens to others. In this case, it happened to us. We believed in the state, but we hadn't actually understood and come to terms with the limitations of the state and how a state can sort of end up serving itself rather than the people who vote for its governments. We advocated wealth redistribution as a party very energetically and very enthusiastically, but we didn't have a credo that embraced how wealth was created in our economy, through enterprise, through risk-taking, through market forces. We said we believed in society and in community. Again, we felt that and said so passionately, but we didn't quite come to terms with how to make that community secure and that society safe. We seemed too much to be on the side of the criminal rather than the victim. We tended to see politics, I think if I can sum it up in this way, as an either-or agenda rather than and. In the Labour Party, in the 70s and 80s, we thought that in politics you could either be for the haves or for the have-nots, but you couldn't be both. We had to realise that actually you can be for both. You can believe in proper rewards and incentives for those who have something but want to make more in those lives, and at the same time introduce a national minimum wage, as we did when we eventually got back to government, to help the low-paid in our society. We discovered that actually you can be tough on criminals, and you need to be, but you can also be tough on the causes of crime that brings people to slip into crime in the first place, and that you can be patriotic. You could believe in your country, Britain, but that you could also be a fully paid up member of the European Union, that it wasn't either or. And we introduced, therefore, the politics of and that's what drove a New Labour. And I'm unashamed to say that the reason we did so is because we wanted to win again. We were fed up with losing. And I wanted to craft a strategy when I came to work for the Labour Party at the tender age of 32 as its sort of first newly created Director of Campaigns and Communications. I helped craft a strategy that actually took the less well-off in society, the have-nots, if you like, who the Labour Party has always championed and stood for, but created a coalition that also embraced people in the professions, people on middle and higher incomes, who might have something and might be doing well in society, but nonetheless had values and beliefs that wanted to see a combination of both social justice in Britain, but also economic efficiency. Not either or, but both. and to create an enduring base of support that would not only get us into government, but keep us there for longer than any time we had been in government before. You know, these Labour governments that we've just seen in Britain over the last decade have, for the first time in the Labour Party's history, succeeded in being elected and re-elected to government for 3 full terms. Before that, since our history as a government, we'd never been able to be re-elected to 2 full terms in office. That's how out of touch, you know, we had become. And if you ask me if I'm proud that as a result of the new Labour revolution that we forged, that we went on to win those 3 successive general election victories, you bet I'm proud of that. Because I realised that Labour can achieve nothing if it doesn't actually win. And Labour won't win unless it is and remains New Labour. In other words, in touch with the public, fighting its politics from the centre ground and not from the fringe of the left, and putting together a coalition of people, of haves and the have-nots in society. And I think we delivered. We delivered the longest period of sustained economic growth Britain has seen at any time in the last 50 years, until, of course, we came up against the buffers of the financial crisis. Investment and reform of our public services on a scale that we hadn't seen in Britain since the Second World War. New social and individual rights created for people in Britain. The only government that actually saw crime at a lower rate when it came out of office than had been the case when we came in. That hadn't been the case in any government in Britain since the Second World War. Leaders in combating climate change, for example, and using our influence around the world through our alliances and our position in Europe. And yet, after 13 years in power, this year we lost the election. Why? If we had overhauled ourselves so successfully, if we had done so well in government, if we were so in tune with the British people, if we had rethought our outlook so well and so successfully, why did we lose this year? Well, partly it's because people just felt we'd had a good innings and it was somebody else's chance to have a go. A natural thought for people. Partly because of the global economic crisis and the economic insecurity that people felt. Partly because for many, Iraq and its aftermath had been a military intervention too far, and we lost some support for that reason. And also partly because some people saw in the opposition leader, David Cameron, the sort of easy charm and style of Tony Blair, and thought that they actually would like to give him a chance and get back a bit of that easy charm and style. They'll discover that, of course, that easy charm and style isn't enough to be a good prime minister. But you know, there was another reason. There was another reason why we lost. And I want to be honest with you about this because it's very important again for people, whether they be in parties or governments or leading countries or leading businesses or enterprises. We started to be a bit complacent. We started to be a bit too sort of pleased with what we were doing and what we had done. And we had stopped thinking adequately about what we were going to do next. We had stopped looking round the next political or commercial corner in the case of many of you running businesses. We stopped articulating a strong new Labour vision and set of goals and aspirations. We fought on our record, including blunting the duration and impact of the recession in Britain, the one that nearly succeeded in taking our economy over a cliff. But we didn't offer a bold enough programme for the 4th term. And whilst people might like a government's policies, they're not going to vote in gratitude for what a government has done in the past. They're going to vote for what that government is going to do next for them and their families. It's exactly the same in businesses. People might have enjoyed the product or a service offered by a business in the past, but what they're actually interested in is where that product and that service is going to go next, whether it's going to be as good as it used to be, but more importantly, whether it's going to be better than what the competition is offering at the same time. And if you rest on your laurels, people will overtake you. If you stop innovating, you'll stop growing. Lose touch with your customer base, as we did with our voters, and they'll very quickly start looking round for an alternative. And it's the same with countries. Stop building on your advantages, and you will forget what makes you attractive to others who buy your goods and services, or who choose or not to invest in your country. And they'll easily take their investment and their demand for what you produce elsewhere, where they can find something better. Now, that, I think, is the lesson that Singapore is teaching us in the rest of the world. Singapore is not a country that rests on its laurels. There seems to be an eternal, persistent restlessness about Singapore. Singapore always has to do things slightly differently, slightly better than it was doing before. It doesn't sit on its record. It doesn't sit on its sales. It's looking for what it can do better and differently in order to sell more to different people in different markets. And that's exactly the same as how politics has to be as well. There is a political marketplace out there, and a lot of inquiring, ambitious, pressing, demanding political consumers. And if you stop innovating, and if you stop thinking about the day after, and next week, and next year, then people will stop thinking about you in return. Which brings me to what I want to say last, and that is to thank two people, if I may. One, the most important of all, is a man who I have come to know quite well over the last 15 years, somebody who I've seen probably once a year, however fleetingly, for each of those 15 years, and that's Singapore's minister mentor, Lee Kuan Yew. What he started here is quite extraordinary, and what he has taught me in our conversations has also been quite extraordinary for me about Singapore and its success and its model, about Asia, about China, about leadership above all. And what he has done, and those who have worked for him and with him in Singapore, is give the rest of the world a very strong object lesson in leadership. And that's why he will remain and go down in history as one of the most distinguished political leaders of the last century. And secondly, the other person I'd like to thank is my friend B.S. Ong. Now, he's a personality. You may or may not know him or have heard of him, but he's certainly a personality. And before the summer, when I was here also in Singapore, I had dinner with the very, very voluble, restless B.S. Ong and the very, very intelligent and opinionated minister mentor. And I tell you, throughout that dinner for 3 hours, I barely got a word in edgeways. And therefore, it actually took me having to write a book, come back all the way to Singapore, get a podium up here to speak to the rest of you in order to get a word in edgeways. And that I have done with great enjoyment. I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to coming back and visiting Singapore many times in the future. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to begin by endorsing the call, and I'm sure you approve of this. Please buy the book. And I'm going to give you...
They're not leaving until they bought the book.
No, in Singapore, we allow freedom of expression.
I've always noticed that it's pretty carefully guided.
Anyway, to give you a flavor of the book, I found one quote. And I think if you listen to this quote, then you have a sense of how good the book is. This is Tony Blair writing a memo. And this is what he says in his memo. He says, and I quote, "Have you any idea how despairing it is for me when the two people who have been closest to me for over a decade and who in their different ways are the most brilliant minds of their generation will not lay aside their personal animosity and help me win?" And the two most brilliant minds, of course, were Gordon Brown and Peter Mandelson. So I guess my first question to you is, how is it you could sort of fight each other so much and still cooperate? What's the secret?
Well, I'll tell you that, although the first observation I would make is that actually that's pretty rich coming from Tony Blair. As the reason for my falling out with Gordon Brown was over him. And the reason it was over him is because I allegedly backed Tony Blair rather than Gordon Brown for the Labour leadership in 1994, and Gordon and his supporters did not forgive or forget until, of course, at that moment, following the Singapore Formula One race, Gordon Brown asked me to come back, to join his government and come back from my very, very enjoyable self-imposed exile in Brussels. But let me make just a wider point to you, because it really matters. Unlike a business where you have a board of directors, chairman, who appoint and hire a chief executive, a CEO, whose mandate is to get on and deliver the goods, and he employs managers and staff who have to take his orders, and if they don't, they're paid off or fired. In politics, it's different. In politics, you're not hired or fired, you're elected. And when you're elected, you represent a point of view or a group of people or a school of thought in your party, and politics becomes about negotiation, not hiring and firing. It becomes about accommodating different people and different opinions or different shades of thought, all of which have to be embraced and pulled together. And you can't simply dispense with that or sack that or fire the other, except in extremis, as I found out. And politics is also about not producing a single product or a single service. It's much more complex than that. There is a huge range of different types of product, services that bear almost no resemblance to each other whatsoever, being generated from the same sort of governmental source. So you also need horses for courses. So a business that operates by discipline in politics has to operate on the basis of voluntary cooperation, volunteered unity, as opposed to imposed cohesion. And that makes it all the more important for the people who make up that government or cabinet or whatever, all with different ideas, big personalities, rival ambitions, who want to get to different places. They have got to sacrifice enough of their own individual point of view and ambition in order to work with others to make that government work. And it's sometimes messy, it sometimes breaks down, and sometimes you find individuals putting their interests before the collective whole of the government in question. Now, did that happen in our case? Yes, up to a point it did. You had two guys at the top of the government, Blair and Brown, one the CEO and the other sort of finance director, who had slightly different views, not on all things, but on some things, policy issues. For example, reform of public services, how the state should change, how individuals should be empowered. These were not fundamental differences. They were capable of being embraced within the same party and government. Nonetheless, they were competing points of view. Towards the end, I would say that the policy differences did get quite strong, and they outweighed what the two of those very, very fine politicians and ministers agreed on. But for the bulk of our time in government, that wasn't the case. For the bulk of our time in government, we did agree. We had a common agenda. We pursued agreed objectives. And in the main, I would say 80% plus, we delivered. That 20% that we didn't, in my view, was a casualty of politicians not being able to get on sufficiently and cooperate strongly enough. And that's a lesson, both in politics and, I would say, for business as well. Work strongly together, you will be able to deliver far, far more than you would do if you were unable to agree on what you were doing and chose to fall out instead.
Thank you. The first hand out there, I see Simon Chesterman. He's promised to ask a very difficult question. Please do.
Thank you, Dr. Mandelson, for an interesting...
Hey, can you go to the microphone there? Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting and I'm Australian, so I can probably use that first.
We can hear you.
I think it's okay, yeah.
Okay, anyway, you can. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, primarily focusing on British politics. It's, of course, memoir season, and I heard that there's some other British politicians selling his memoirs. At some point soon, we expect...
That's in the sort of, what's that, the fiction section? I don't know, I haven't seen it. I haven't.
Occasionally it's found only in the shoe department, so... And eventually George Bush will release his memoirs, although I gather the editors are worried that he actually read it before...
Now, come now. Let's going into the crime and thriller section. All these remarks, by the way, are off the record. I should have said that at the outset. Go on, Simon.
I want to ask you a question about foreign policy, and one thing you didn't have a chance to talk about in your presentation, but I know you looked at in your book, is that very many things did on Northern Ireland. But I wanted to ask you about transatlantic relations, because rightly or wrongly, and I'm sure he suspects, at least wrongly, Tony Blair's prime ministership is dominated by the Iraq War. When George Bush became president, Bill Clinton was approached by Blair and asked, what should I do with this guy? And Clinton told Blair, I gather, be his friend. I wanted to ask you whether you thought, with the benefit of hindsight, that was good advice or not.
Yes, I do think it was good advice, because the United States is the indispensable nation in the world. You can't do what you want to achieve in any sphere of international relations, whether it be social or economic or fighting climate change or getting a trade round through to its conclusion, and many, many other areas, without the United States, and therefore its president has to be your friend. You are there to persuade the United States, to see things your way, or to share your analysis, or to join your objectives, or it's to make sure that the United States is for you and not against you, an ally rather than an opponent. So of course a Prime Minister, certainly a British Prime Minister, has to look to the American President as his friend, not least because it's up to the American people to elect who they want to be their president. It's not up to us to choose who we want to be president of the United States. We don't have a choice. That choice, that outcome is given to us by the American voters. So you're not going to turn around and say to the American voters, oh, I'm sorry, I don't like your choice very much. I'm not going to sort of speak to this guy. I don't want this president to be my friend because I don't agree with who you've elected. You can't operate in that way. Now, having said that, is it your job to make sure that the friendship that you conduct with the US President is a candid and a frank relationship? Yes, it is. Is it your job to persuade the American President of certain things that he should do or do differently and not do other things, or at least do them differently? Yes, it is. At the end of the day, of course, the President of the United States will make up his own mind, and the rest of the world will live with it. But what's changing in the world, and this is the important point I want to make to you, what's changing in the world is that whilst we may have only one superpower left in the world, certainly a military one, but in other respects too, the United States, the US does not represent the only pole in the world around which everyone else revolves. There's more than one pole in the world. There is an American pole. There's also a European pole in the world. There's also a Chinese pole in the world. And I could go on. We live in a multipolar world, in other words. And the only way in which a multipolar world is going to work is by multilateral organization, multilateral discussion and negotiation and agreement, and by collective effort. It's why, incidentally, that I praise and welcome the emergence of the G20. Seen of a very successful summit in London in April 2009, when we cooperated and brought all our policies together to fight the financial crisis and the recession. I tell you, that recession could have turned into a depression if it hadn't been for the leadership that, in my view, the British Prime Minister showed to the G20, and which the G20 showed to the rest of the world. The G20, in my view, has overtaken the G7 as the emerging steering committee of the global economy. But don't ever imagine for one moment that the United States is simply one amongst equals. It isn't. It is a powerful, indispensable nation, and one that we have to be a friend of and not an enemy of.
Thank you. Next question. Yeah, I see a hand at the very back there. Just come to the mic, please. Do you want to identify yourselves? Yeah.
Good afternoon, Lord Mandelson. Good afternoon, Professor Mahbubani. My name is Marco Francis. I am a Malaysian, and I'm currently studying A-levels at Tanling Trust School. I would first like to say, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to allow me to raise a question which I believe is of great importance today. Since 2001, Britain and our allies have been engaged in the war on terror, in combating extremism and in promoting freedom of speech, religion, and the civil rights which everyone in the West does have. I would like to question whether the strategies which the US have utilized in combating extremism have worked, and if you do not believe that this is the case, what do you think the reasons are for it, and what do you believe should be done about it? I would also like to extend this question to Professor Mahbubani. Thank you.
No, today I think it's his day.
Well,
I'm not selling my book today.
thank you very much for the very pertinent and very intelligent question. Look, I think that in the world we have a responsibility to do two things. One, stand up for what we believe in, and secondly, protect ourselves from those who want to do us damage. Those are the two fundamental things that you do in the world. Now, as far as the damage is concerned and the threat that now is posed by terrorist organizations, it's of a different form. It's on a different scale than we have known it at any time in our history. People prepared to take very extreme actions to harm, maim, or kill very large numbers of people, to do so in a completely unscrupulous way, to do so without warning, obviously, and calculated to inflict the maximum damage and distress to those who become their involuntary targets. Now, is anyone telling me that either that threat does not exist as I've described it, or that all of us don't have a duty to work together to combat it and defeat it, which we will, but it's not going to be done this year or next. I think we will be living with this terrorist threat for certainly a couple of decades. Now, we have to take the precautionary action. And sometimes in applying a new sort of test or judgment to that sort of calculus of risk that's been created in the world, we may overreact, better in my opinion than underreacting. We may make mistakes, but better not to be so fearful of making mistakes that you don't act at all. And it may well be the case that people feel that where we've taken action and where we've intervened, we've involved ourselves inappropriately or improperly in the domestic affairs of another nation. Well, certainly, in the case of the last, we have to operate on the basis of international law. We have to operate wherever possible under the guidance and with the sanction of the United Nations, and we have to use the minimum of force, but sometimes, I'm afraid, necessary force in order to protect ourselves and make the world secure. Now, there was something else, though, that we need to stand up for, and that's what we believe in, our values. And this is even more difficult, because although there are, in my opinion, values that are universal, there are principles about how people should be entitled to live in the world that should be respected by all. When it comes to the means of enforcing those and giving each individual that freedom or that protection that they're entitled to expect, you'll have some very difficult issues raised about when one country or a group of countries, a coalition of the willing, should intervene on those people's behalf by crossing borders in order to secure those ends. This is a really difficult, troubling area of public policy and decision-making in the world. We are by no means at the end point of knowing what we should do, on what conditions and in what circumstances. We're not at the end. We are at the beginning of that deliberation, in my view. And we will advance, yes, by some trial and some error, but we will, I hope, be motivated by what's right rather than what is simply or purely in our self-interest to do. Politics is unpredictable. International politics is incredibly unpredictable and also volatile. That's why we have got to tread carefully and feel the stones as we advance. But that's better, in my view, than standing still, doing nothing, and waiting for the worst to happen either to you or other people who simply are too weak or vulnerable to defend themselves and need help.
Can I ask 2 quick follow-up questions? Just instead of answering the young man's question. You mentioned international law. As you know, Kofi Annan was once forced in a BBC interview to say that the Iraq war was illegal. Would you agree or disagree with that statement? And the second question was, again, it was reported in some quarters that Gordon Brown disagreed with the decision to go into war in Iraq. Can you confirm or deny that?
Well, I can confirm that he agreed with the decision. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. He was effectively the Prime Minister's number 2. I think if he disagreed with it, you'd have known about it. And certainly it was too important an issue for him to keep quiet about it, So No, I take his position and what he said at the time at face value. Was it illegal? Well, I respect those who argue that it wasn't legal. I happen to believe those who have argued nonetheless that there was a basis in international law and the Security Council decisions of the United Nations that made the intervention in Iraq not just necessary but also law-abiding. But as I say, other people will differ in that. I respect their judgment, I respect their point of view, but I would also say that there will be circumstances that arise again in our world when we cannot spend forever and a day hearing the views of different lawyers before we take a decision to act or react in the face of what we regard as a real threat to the world. Lawyers, yes, but let's understand that lawyers are a bit like economists.
And you meant that as a compliment.
And I meant that as a compliment.
Next question. I see a hand out there, a blue shirt, I think. Yes, please come to the mic. Yeah, identify yourself and. Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to get on your good side here because I haven't read the book, but I have bought one. So maybe the answer to the question is buried in.
You'll get the first signature.
At the end of your talk, you touched on the area of leadership and the change in government that we've had recently. Maybe that was the tipping point. I wanted to ask you a question about when you were in the heady days of when you were 32, in charge of communications, and with the Thatcher period that we'd had versus maybe Michael Foot, Neil Kinnock. How cognizant were you at that age and at that period that maybe this was going to be about leadership rather than policy to affect a change?
That's a very good question. I mean, that was in 1985, when Mrs. Thatcher was not desperately popular, given the things she was doing in Britain at the time, but a time in which Labour was hopelessly deficient in winning any election to replace Mrs. Thatcher. The point being that it doesn't simply take the unpopularity of a government for an opposition to win. The opposition has to be equipped with the right people, the right policies, and be on the same wavelength of enough people in the country to be looked to as a credible alternative, even to a country, even to a government that many people have fallen out of love with. And that's something the Labour Party's got to bear in mind as it embarks on this, I hope, short period of opposition in the coming years. But I'll tell you what I felt at that time. I felt the Labour Party in the mid-1980s was not just desperately going out of fashion. You know, it was flirting with a near-death experience. I mean, our policies, our attitudes to events, the people speaking for us, these were not vote-winning. They were vote-losing times for the Labour Party. And I felt that I had been put in my job in order to help lead a fight back against that near-death experience. And I suppose if I had been older, more experienced and more mature as a person, I would have taken fewer chances, fewer risks with my own position. I probably would have been nicer to everyone. Wouldn't have made enemies, probably wouldn't have stepped over people in order to help the Labour Party's onward march to electability. I wouldn't have probably made a lot of mistakes, you know, if I had been more experienced and made more mature. But I'll tell you something also, I wouldn't have made the same difference that I was able to make in those years and after. You know, yes, I rubbed people up the wrong way. I was at the cutting edge of change in our party, and I said things that people didn't want to hear. I talked about policies that people cherished, but which I knew we would never be elected to implement and would probably cause a lot of damage if we did implement them. And I said so. And I was outspoken. And I was uncompromising. But you know, all those years ago in the 1980s, somebody had to be. And there were precious few others volunteering to be as uncompromising beside me. So, yes, it had a long-term effect on my political career and prospects. That's true. But then I don't think I and a lot of others in the Labour Party would have had any long-term career or prospects if we hadn't done what we needed to do in the Labour Party in those early years.
I see a hand out there, please. Then after that, one more. It's always at the end that the hands come up. I don't understand this, you know. Please.
My name is Jan Lund. I'm a writer from the Kingdom of Denmark. Peter, you have been called the first spin doctor in the world.
Sorry?
Spin doctor.
Spin doctor.
Spin doctor.
Okay, okay.
30 years from now.
I've been called one or two other things as well.
Can you mention a few?
No, but I just wonder, it's about 30 years ago, and nowadays there are spin doctors all over the place. How do you see this institution, which it is now, has changed the relationship between politics and the press, and the politics and the public in general?
I tell you what I think. I think that spin doctoring, as you call it, is not a substitute for good policy and good decisions in government. You know, you can't make up for what you're doing wrongly or badly in government by good presentation or by good spin. Forget that. I tried it once myself. It didn't work, and so we had to sort of change the party and its policies in order to get where we wanted to be. And you know, despite the attractiveness of the early spray paint job that I did on the Labour Party. But whilst spin doctoring is no substitute for good policy, effective management of the media is necessary if you're going to get anywhere with your policy. And I'll tell you why. We live in an age now, an internet age, where we see a proliferation of media, bombarding you, the public, with information, views, opinions, sometimes very difficult to see what's opinion and what's fact, what's information and what's hearsay. There's such a sort of glut of information out there in the blogosphere that it's actually very difficult for you to judge between the sources of information that are bombarding you, but presents us in politics with the absolute necessity to feed that glut of media with as much fact, accurate information, as well as our own viewpoint, quite honestly, because as a government, as politicians, we're entitled to our views along with everyone else, you know. And yet it's very easy to find them completely submerged, buried under a sort of mountain of gossip, hearsay, personality, guff, and misinformation. Now, I don't criticize the media, as I've made clear. They're all our friends. They're only trying to earn a decent crust in a very difficult and challenging and competitive world. All I would say is...
Now you've got to say that more sincerely.
I'm sorry, the words have got stuck in my head. But whilst there are plenty of you out there, there are going to have to be plenty of us up here trying to manage you and get the truth to the public.
You're running out of time, but I'm going to give two more questions. One over there, and then the British High Commissioner is going to have the last question. Please. I'm sorry, if you had put up your hands earlier, I was told by George Joseph to finish at 2:20, right? So...
Thank you, Lord Mandelson. I'm an economist.
Thank God you're not a lawyer.
Never piss off an economist. Roman Scott, economic spokesman for the British Chamber of Commerce. I want to ask a question.
I mean, look, you know, economists obviously have made a huge contribution.
You can sign the book afterwards. During the period pre-crisis of New Labour, the government actually presided over a period of very strong economic growth, which economists usually expect fiscal deficits to go down, but fiscal deficits went up. So Britain ended up going into a crisis where, of course, they had to spend a lot more money to rescue banks with an exceedingly high deficit position. The Conservative Party has accused New Labour of being fiscally irresponsible, quote. I'd like you to comment on whether you believe that was correct. And in the same vein, comment on the current Cameron-Clegg government's very aggressive cuts to government deficit, including the latest announcement they'll take British defence spend down to about the level of Spain or Italy.
If we're lucky. Look, I think the new government's criticism and judgment of us is harsh. I think it's unfair. You would expect me to say that. But you know, our deficit, which was not by any means the worst amongst the G7, we were sort of in the middle there, could have been handled and tidied over, rolled over, if at the time growth had continued at the rate we were experiencing. But a dirty great hole was blown in our GDP. Growth was knocked sideways. We were unable, therefore, to sustain that level of spending and borrowing. Well, hindsight's a great thing. And that's why I say, although I think that we should probably, by 2006, 2007, been busy identifying where public expenditure savings, alternatives, higher productivity, means of delivering the same level or quality of public services. All this is work that actually should have been carried on and was to an extent, but not sufficiently, in the British government at that time. I don't think that gives sufficient sort of basis for, you know, condemnation, as the present government are trying to argue, of our entire fiscal record during 13 years in government. One thing I do know now, though, is, and I said it in government, I've said it whenever anyone has asked me, we need a serious plan in Britain for paying down our debt. It was debt necessarily incurred in order to get us out of and through the recession. You know, when you're caught in a storm like we were in 2000 and 2008, you know, you have to accelerate out of a storm. You don't just sort of, you know, turn the engine off and sit there and hope that it will pass. You'll find yourself completely buried. We certainly had to accelerate out of that storm, and we burned up fuel as we did so, and we had to pay for it. But there comes a point, and this is a matter of judgment, where you take your foot off the accelerator and apply a bit of the brake to the stimulus that you're operating. You've also got to have a realistic plan for redressing that deficit. We had one, halving it over 4 years. I think the new government, partly because they are exaggerating, honestly, objectively exaggerating the danger posed to us by the markets, but also because they have a certain appetite for public spending cuts. They do want to shrink the state and see and have the government doing less, whether it be in education or health or transport or police or whatever it is. I think they have to be careful. Careful that they don't stall our economic recovery by slamming on the brakes too sharply and prematurely, and that secondly, they don't leave our public services in a position where we have in later years to spend so much more and invest so much more in order to catch up with the cuts that will have occurred in the meantime. That, frankly, is what happened to us in the 1970s and the 80s. Labour and Conservative governments were, in my view, operating a sort of stop-go policy in public spending and investment. Well, much better than sort of lurching forward and then stopping, would go at a gentle pace that you can sustain, rather than one that is going to head into the buffers leave you sort of stalled and then with a more difficult job in starting up and revving up the engine subsequently. So steady and calm and gentle would be my way out of this recession, not sort of short, sharp shocks to the economy.
Now for the last question, I'm going to the British High Commissioner. I'm curious to find out whether he'll ask a diplomatic or undiplomatic question.
I know him, he's a great guy, and
you should fix him, I think.
And he's bought a lot of copies of the book. Lord Mandelson, living in this part of the world, one of the things that you often hear is that the West is finished, that it's lost its energy, it's lost its dynamism and creativity, and that the rise of Asia inevitably means that Europe is finished. Now, personally, I don't subscribe to that at all, and I'm sure that the representatives from the British Chamber of Commerce don't subscribe to it either. But if, for example, you found yourself sitting at lunch in the Raffles Hotel next to someone who had been expounding those sorts of views, I wonder what you'd say to him.
You try to fix him, he fix me.
I would say that I've just spent a week in China, and there was a country that hasn't got all the answers, hasn't got all the solutions, and is looking to the West for what? Advanced technologies, ways of adding value as they move up the supply chain, the production chain, need our skills, need our intellectual property in so many different ways, need our demand for their goods, incidentally, and also need our investment as much of as our know-how as our capital stock. So what I would say to that person sitting beside me is two things. You're doing a lot right, but you don't have the monopoly of wisdom. Secondly, we still have a lot to offer. I mean, not only our know-how and our investment, but also our markets in North America and in Europe, which are huge, have massive disposable income, and want to buy the sorts of things you're becoming increasingly good at producing and providing. And that thirdly, and most importantly, this world is not going to thrive or prosper, not us, not Singapore, not the West, not Asia, by pursuing beggar your neighbour policies. You know, the globalization is an extraordinary thing, and it's brought through its openness boom enormous benefits and opportunities. It's transformed the individual lives, lifestyles and potential of people in our world. But globalization can go wrong if it doesn't have the right mix of policies to sustain it and make it not just secure, but environmentally friendly and sustainable too. It takes all of us to provide and make up the mix of those policies. All of us, not just some, not just the new kids on the block in Asia, but some of the older hands as well in the global economy and the international system. So let's not think that we can operate and pursue our own well-being by playing a zero-sum game in this world. We win, you lose. The best way to succeed is if through our own success we make sure that everyone else succeeds as well. And on that happy and optimistic note, I will thank you for your question and say to everyone else, I hope you enjoy the book.